Okay, I think we can start. So thank you all for being here, the audience online and in person. This is an MPC seminar, and we're very glad to host Chiara Berneri for her book presentation, her latest book on private sponsorship in Europe. Of refugees in Europe. Chiara Berneri is a law lecturer at the Open University since September 2021. A research interest focused in particular on the intersection between immigration law, human rights, state sovereignty, and citizenship. She has published 2 other books with Hart, and she's published also in leading journals, such as the European Journal of Migration and Law and the European Journal of Law and Economics. So without further ado, please, Chiara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lydia, for the introduction and for having me today. It's really an honor. And this is the first presentation that I give after the publication of the book, which the book came out on the 17th of October. So I'm very happy to be here to present it. And yeah, keen to hear what you think and get your feedback on board. So this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about in the next 20-25 minutes. It looks a lot, but I promise we'll get to the end. Just to give you a bit of an overview of what I'm going to do and why I'm doing it this way. So as you can see in this slide, the first bullet points are about questions. Question 1, contextualizing private sponsorship of refugees. And question 2, private sponsorship of refugees and state sovereignty. These were the questions that moved my research. When I first got interested in private sponsorship of refugees was back in 2015 when I read a paper by Judith Cumin that was published on the Migration Policy Center. And I really got interested in what she said because she was, at the time, private sponsorship of refugees were just appearing in the European scenario. And she tried to explain what they were about, but she also tried to give some suggestions for the future to states and also to the European Union on how to implement them, improve them. And so that sparked my initial interest. So in this book, one of the purposes of this book, the first purpose of this book, it was to understand a little bit better what they are, contextualizing them within their proper background, within the immigration background and refugee law. And that's what I tried to do, I guess, from chapter 1 till chapter 4. And then I got, in the last part of the book, I got into my second question, which I think, from my perspective, was I think the most intriguing to me, at least. I don't know about the others, which is the relationship between private sponsorship and state sovereignty. So how do this scheme fit within state sovereignty, so the power of the state on migration? So in this presentation, I'll try to give you a flavor of what I've done. So let's start from the first question, contextualizing private sponsorship of refugees. Towards the end of chapter 2, I try to give a bit of a definition of what private sponsorships are. And I have to admit, I struggled a bit with the definition because there are different definitions. So the first point of the slide, I give, it's an extract of 2019 document of the UNHCR, in which the UNHCR says community sponsorship of refugees allows individuals, group of individuals or organizations to come together to provide financial, emotional, and practical support for the reception and integration of refugees admitted to third countries. So this is a broad and I think very encompassing definition, but there are different nuances and different flavors. So, for example, more recently, the UNHCR has started to make a very stark and clear distinction between community sponsorships and private sponsorships. So to put it very simply, according to the UNHCR, private sponsorships are schemes that provide financial, emotional, and practical support from the admission phase. So admission, reception, and integration. So from the very, very beginning, whereas community sponsorship deal just with the reception and integration. So the sponsor, the groups do not worry about the initial phase, but get into the sponsorship at a later phase. So there is now this distinction. However, if we look at the European Union definition, the definition is much more flexible because the European Union talks about private sponsorship and community sponsorship interchangeably. So they're considered a bit as synonyms. And not just the European Union, because if you read some papers, many authors apply this approach. So in my book, I used a very personal approach, I would say. So I used the term interchangeably. So I talk about private sponsorships in the title, but I really also talk about what the UNHCR would say community sponsorship. And in chapter 3, I talk about private sponsorship as tool to resettlement. What does that mean? In my classification, I use this term because in this chapter, I put all the schemes that, to my view, operatively resemble resettlement. And that's a classification that worked for me for the analysis that I also propose in chapter 5. In chapter 4, I put other schemes that from my perspective, do not resemble resettlement. So I consider them as private sponsorship, but they resemble more other form of admission, like family reunification, for example. So that's the distinction that I apply in the book. And this is just my take. Obviously, I don't propose this being the definite description. I think it worked for me, but I think in this field, flexibility in the definition perhaps is not bad, because particularly in Europe, we have different schemes with different facets, and sometimes we struggle to put them in the right box. So that's my approach on the classification. And also I talk a lot about naming and additionality. So to sum up, these are the key features that I think characterize private sponsorship. So you have a scheme where the sponsor has a financial, social, and emotional grants financial, social, and emotional support for admission and or reception and integration of the beneficiaries. In some programs, individual sponsors or sponsoring organization have also the option to identify the persons that should benefit, and this is called naming, although I have to say that in Europe, there are some schemes that introduce a sort of naming, but it's not to the extent of the Canadian sponsorship. It's a sort of, I call it, diluted version of naming. And then the third key feature from my perspective is additionality. So you have some schemes that are available in Europe that allow people to enter in addition to the resettlement quotas that are granted by the state. So here in chapter 3, as I said, I describe sponsorships that resemble resettlement. And I have talks about these schemes. This is just to give you a bit of an overview, and perhaps we can talk about the schemes more in detail towards the end, or if you have questions. But as you can see, there are many, and in many states. So you have the humanitarian corridors organized by the Sant'Egidio community together with the Tavola Valdese, Caritas, and they operate in Italy, France, Belgium, and Andorra. The UK community sponsorship, the NEST program in Germany, community sponsorship in Ireland, the Auzulana program in Spain, the Basque Country, the Belgian community sponsorship, the Portuguese community sponsorship pilot, still a pilot. And then we have also some expired programs that run for a shorter period of time in Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. Some of these programs, like, for example, the humanitarian corridor, encompass additionality and diluted version of naming. Some others just additionality, like the UK community sponsorship or the NEST program in Germany. Some others instead do not have features of additionality or naming, like Ireland, for example, although there are talks to introduce additionality, the Belgian community sponsorship, the Portuguese pilot, and the Auzulana program. In chapter 4, instead, we have the sponsorship that I call them as form of admission different from resettlement. So they resemble more other forms like family reunification or other forms of humanitarian admission, and also relocation. Now you have, for example, it's expired, but the Portuguese relocation scheme was also characterized by private sponsorship element, because the community was helping, not just emotionally, but also financially. Okay, here I have a list also of private sponsorship that are not included in the book. Those that are outside Europe are not included because my research only focused on Europe. And we also have 2 that are still developing in Sweden and in the Netherlands that are considered community or private sponsorship. I haven't included them because in this sponsorship, there isn't yet, we'll see, a financial aspect involved. It's the sort of integration help, but not the financial aspect yet. And then finally, a very brief word of private sponsorship and complementary pathways. Again, also in this field, there's a little bit of, I wouldn't call it confusion, but at least different approaches. And I think that goes back to the problem of the definition, because different people have different approaches in terms of definition, and that reflects on the way we look at private sponsorships in relation to complementary pathways. So on the left, the image is taken from the 2019 UNHCR document. And this is the approach that I have in the book. So I look at private/community sponsorship as a group within the umbrella of the complementary pathways. And that's why I only look at them. But in the book, I don't talk about, for example, the education pathways or the labor pathways, etc. I do somehow in some footnotes or just as a reference, but not explicitly. But if you look on your right, there's this is an image taken from a document that is on the Share Network website. And this is an organization that wants to put together different actors that deal with private sponsorship and complementary pathways in Europe. And they have a slightly different approach because, as you can see, the three arrows, the pink, they talk about resettlement, then they have sponsorship, private sponsorship, and then the complementary pathways. So they consider these as three different forms of admission, and then community sponsorship as something that can complement these three different forms of admission. So it's a slightly different approach. But as I said, in the book, I adopt the UNHCR approach, which is similar to what the EU does. Okay, so in a nutshell, this is how I dealt with the first question on putting the private sponsorship into a bit of a context. Now, the second question, and I think this was the more complicated from my perspective and perhaps a little bit controversial. So from my research, which was, I want to say it, purely desk-based, I haven't done empirical research, and I consider this book as the first brick of a house, I hope, that I will build in the future, because I have in mind to do more and eventually some empirical research, because I'll tell you later, I'm interested in a particular aspect. But anyway, from the desk-based research that I did and some conversations with the key actors in the European sponsorships, what I've understood is that it looks like that schemes that are characterized by naming and additionality seem to be more successful than the others in terms of number of beneficiaries that can benefit from the schemes, and also in terms of sponsor retention. To give you an example in terms of numbers, like the UK community sponsorship in comparison to the humanitarian corridors in Italy, because in other countries they have, although they are still organized by Sant'Egidio, they have different settlement with different states. But in Italy, compared to the UK, so we have the UK scheme, which is additional, but selection is not allowed. In the Italian one, it's additional with diluted naming allowed. In the same time window that goes between 2016, 2017 till beginning of 2023. We also have to consider that there was the pandemic in between, so that slowed things down incredibly in both scenarios. But we have 1,000, more or less 1,000 people admitted in the UK versus 4,500 in Italy. Now, these are, if we think about the need of resettlement in the world, it's still a drop in the ocean, of course. But there is a striking difference. Also in terms of retention of sponsors, there is already research that on the Canadian schemes and also on the Belgian one, in which sponsors have been interviewed, and quite a few have said that naming they would prefer to have naming, because that would give them a better sense of ownership of the scheme. And also they would feel with naming and additionality that they are really making a change for society, because they are adding to the numbers that would come in with the state, through the state anyway. So, despite the fact that naming and additionality seem to be crucial or important, some states seem to shy away from including these features in their programs. So in terms of possibility to select, it's just really the humanitarian corridors. And they were thinking about introducing it in the Portuguese pilot, but now it's recent. I talked to this person that is in charge of building up the Portuguese pilot. At the moment, everything has stopped. Just a family was able to enter, and that's it. We'll see what happens there. So it's really just the humanitarian corridors. And additionality as well. So we have more schemes that include additionality, but the Irish one doesn't. For example, the Basque Country doesn't. Then we have talks in the Northern European countries like Sweden, Denmark, but they don't like the idea of selecting or to add extra people, because it seems to be most under the remit of what the state should do. So there are, it's not so clear that there's this willingness to take on these features in the schemes. Okay, so there are several reasons. As I said, perhaps some countries feel like the sponsor would be overburdened. Some countries see naming in particular a problem in terms of discrimination, because the places are scarce. If we choose the people, what do we do with the rest? So there are problems. But I also think that on top of these problems that are real, there's also the fact that naming and additionality challenge the power of the state over immigration the most, because effectively, with naming and additionality, the sponsor says to the state, look, I want this person and I want to take as many as I want. So there is this clash. So 2 minutes. Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry, I took it too long. Well, I'll summarize here and then we can discuss. So in my approach, and I looked at some ideas in terms of what do we do when there is a clash with the state sovereignty. And of course, the literature is full. We have these ideas of open borders, no borders. Then you have the philosopher Derrida, who basically says, well, cities of refuge should stand against state sovereignty. Or you have Krivenko, who says, well, state sovereignty should come after, because really the individual is the bearer of sovereignty against the state. I think these are all interesting takes. In the book, what I say is, I call it satisfying state sovereignty. So I want to see I wanted to look at the relationship between the individual, the sponsor, and the state, not as a clash, but as a compromise. So can private sponsorship of refugees characterized by naming and additionality put the state at ease in relation to 3 key areas where the state is mostly concerned about when it comes to immigration, which is welfare, so the economic well-being of the country, integration, and security? And my answer is yes, as long as the sponsor is willing to take the financial responsibility for 1, so welfare, integration, and to a certain extent, security. Now, I will explain better in the questions and answers, but I'm aware that there is criticism to this, and I have underlined areas that could be particularly problematic. States have different types of welfare arrangements. Sponsors feel too financially burdened by the sponsorship. Discrimination, as we looked at, and also reducing the work of the sponsor to something monetarily quantifiable. So I keep on talking about financial responsibility, but what the sponsor does goes beyond that. And so here I try to answer a bit this criticism, but we can see it later. Next steps I would like to do further studies on particularly the Italian humanitarian corridor on Sant'Egidio, because I think it's the one that is closer and resembles the most what I said in the book. And then I also want to look at private sponsorship and green transition, because there are problems there as well. And also, finally, a thing that I discovered during this research, I found it incredibly difficult to gather information, because a lot is available on the internet, but different organizations, some talk to each other, some others don't, and things happen, and we're not fully aware of what is happening, and it's such a fast-pacing area. So I would like to see if some coordination can be ignited. And then I just would like to read something very small that is one of the last pages of my book. So I say, although the idea of state sovereignty has been successfully used to counter these views, so, you know, open borders, no borders, etc., when facing the reality of the cries of people that search for better opportunities for themselves and their families, often risking their lives, can one righteously hide behind the fictitious construction of the supremacy of the state power in all circumstances? Because not only the legitimate claims of state sovereignty are important, but also, if not more so, the development of every human being, which can be achieved by expanding their freedom, even the freedom of seeking better opportunities for themselves and their loved ones. The idea behind this book, then, perhaps, is not so utopian, because this analysis has tried to take into account the real claims of the state, the cry of people that today are seeking another chance in Europe, and the goodwill of our societies in an attempt to outline a concrete proposal to address these tensions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara. And now I'll open the floor for the Q&A. I'll start here in the room, and then for anyone who's following us from online, you can put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and you can unmute yourself, and I'll give you the floor. So starting from the room, yes.
I wonder how it functions in concrete if you have this kind of private sponsorship. So when people want to come to a certain country that offers this, on which title can they stay in the country? So on which legal title? Do they have the same title as a refugee, or as someone who comes with a humanitarian visa, or with employment?
Yeah, let's collect maybe a few questions. Can you please present yourself when, thank you.
My name is Antonia Czuk. I'm coming from the University of Graz, and right now I'm a visitor at the Migration Policy Center.
Andrew?
So I'm Andrew Geddes from the Migration Policy Center. Just a question about, well, sovereignty, legitimacy, and I wonder in that context whether you consider in the book public support for the schemes, because you tend to seem to think about the relationship between communities, sponsors, governments. But I would have thought these kind of programs might be ways to generate public support for refugees. I think actually probably there is already quite a strong base of public support for refugee protection in Europe, but governments often pursuing policies that are going in different directions. I wonder if we have evidence from any of the countries or schemes about public support, whether these schemes can actually make differences also to public attitudes.
And we have one, let's take one and then we'll do another round.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Hi, I'm Valentina Bachin from, I'm a policy leader fellow at School of Transnational Governance. I have two questions. The first one is you said that you find that when there is additionality and naming, the scheme seems to be more successful. And I was wondering if you could maybe say a bit more about how you define success in that case. Is it about numbers? Is it about integration here? And then I think the second question is if you had been able to look at how people are selected at departure, like what are the criteria that are used? I personally was in Lebanon when Sant'Egidio started some of this, and I know they were in the process of designing the scheme. I'm not sure how it developed after that, but I think it would be quite interesting also to understand and maybe compare to other resettlement schemes. Thank you.
Thank you, so Chiara. And if you have more questions online, then I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much for the questions. They're all very interesting. So the first one, what title they can stay on? It really depends on the scheme. So for example, the humanitarian corridors in Italy, Belgium, France, and Andorra, the beneficiaries come with temporary visa, territorial limited visa. They enter with this visa that lasts for 3 months. Once they arrive, they apply for asylum. And so after they apply for asylum, I was told there's a chance they could fail, but they rarely do because there are strong connection also. So the Italian Commission, for example, that checks their case would know that they come through the corridor and they went through selection process, etc. So it's rare that they fail. So once they get the refugee status, their stay is much more stable. And the same for the UK scheme, they enter and they immediately are granted refugee status. And after 5 years, I believe they can apply for permanent and eventually even for citizenship. In Germany, the NEST program grants definitive status. So those programs that I discuss in chapter 3 that I say resemble resettlement from an operational point of view, they all tend to give a permanent answer to the beneficiaries. The other programs, like for example, these now they are expired, but the Swiss, Irish, and German ad hoc family reunification schemes gave a temporary solution. So they granted a visa for 2-3 years, potentially renewable, and that somehow triggered a little bit of problems because these people, they felt like they didn't know exactly the difference between their program and the classic family reunification route, or someone that answers, seeks asylum and becomes a refugee. So they were like, oh, why we are given 3 years, whereas these people are given permanent residence. So that was a bit of a problem because they had to be told. There's also a problem to set the expectations. And in the book, I also say, well, actually, if we are to think about how to improve the sponsorships that we have already, or perhaps how we can think about sponsorship that allow naming and additionality. We also should think about the disparities with similar programs in order to allow a bit of equality and to avoid difficulties and people feeling discriminated for the system that has different channels that don't seem to talk to each other in a way. I hope I answered, but we can go ahead later. So public support, yes. I was talking when I was analyzing the UK community sponsorship. I talked to this lady that used to work at Reset, which is the organization in the UK that deals, that prepares the sponsors, that is a bit of a middle sort of organization between the sponsor and the Home Office. And she was saying, well, for the UK sponsorship, the sponsor has to put together at least £9,000. And we're saying that the support that the public, that the sponsor gets from the broader community is incredible. So you had sponsors organizing fundraising events or crowdfunding on social media, etc. And they would get a lot of positive response. So absolutely, I think it's important at least to raise the awareness, because I think if you raise the awareness, you might have more people willing to help than you think, because not everyone, for example, in the UK sponsorship, the leading sponsor enters into an agreement, a direct agreement with the Home Office. So can be quite scary. You have one person that signs a contract with the Home Office. And so perhaps not everyone is willing to take such a responsibility, but raising the awareness allows, I think, a sponsor that is willing to take such responsibility, but feeling that there is such support in terms of health, financial and non-financial, can help the sponsor to say, okay, I'm willing to do this. So the UK is just an example, but there are other, in Germany, for example, similar events are organized. So in terms of how do I define the, so where do I think that naming and additionality are more successful? What are the terms of success? I think in my book, I think the terms of success were measured mainly in terms of numbers. So more numbers in. And that is not to detract what needs to be done after the numbers, because it's not just enough to get 1,000 people more. Then you also need all the rest. But I think that I would rather initially have more numbers and also work for a better integration. But I think the numbers are important, because 1,000 people more through sponsorship often means 1,000 people less that try a treacherous journey through the sea or other ways towards Europe. So I think numbers is important. That's what I thought in the book. Yeah. I hope I answered.
Thank you, Chiara. And we have one question from the online crowd and also one from here. Aziz Rahman, do you want to unmute yourself to pose the question yourself? Otherwise, I'll read it. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm Aziz Rahman. I'm a postdoc at Texas A&M International University. So my question is actually compared to Canada, private sponsorship or community sponsorship models in Europe are of recent origin so far. But I'm interested to understand the evolution of these models in Europe compared to Canada? And also, as you compare different schemes in your book, how did you do that? Because different schemes have different features in different national context and also with different types of timelines, like the origins. So would you highlight that? And as I understand, and my other colleague also mentioned that naming was found successful, but in Canada these days it has been critiqued because of the violating the goals of resettlement for the vulnerables to be prioritized. But naming is actually selecting people which are known to the sponsors and which are actually not that much vulnerable. So how do you see in the context of Europe? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aziz. And we have one more from the room.
Great. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure listening to you. I'm Tobias Hillenbrand from United Nations University, Uni Merit. Also one question on naming to follow up maybe a bit on the question that we heard just now. I was wondering really what is the pool of people that potential sponsors can even choose from, and what are the information that they receive about them? Also, you spoke about discrimination, like do they see pictures, do they have a call, or do they go through some CV style document or something? And the other question for me was, how long am I actually a sponsor? Like how long lasts this responsibility, and what happens if, for instance, if I lose my job, there's some financial blow, some physical shock or something, I have a disability, I don't know. Many things can happen, right? What happens then, and what happens also to the refugee who's already then in the country, but maybe the sponsor can no longer live up to the responsibilities they assumed initially.
And we have a last one for this round. Friedrich.
Yes, I'm Friedrich Pöschel from the Migration Policy Center. Thank you very much for the presentation. My first question follows up directly from Tobias. So the last time I heard about this topic was precisely in a very legal way, that sponsors were finding after 5 years they were still paying. They probably expected that the person would be, financially stable in a job after a year and a half or something. And they took the state to court to say, this is now your responsibility. And I wonder whether there's any landmark rulings or something that would say, how much burden a sponsor can expect. I mean, this was probably pretty bad press for this kind of model. And the second question is there a problem with secondary migration at all, or how do the schemes approach this problem? Community sponsorship could be great for places in the countryside that feel also depopulation and they get their act together, but then that collapses if people then move on, right? So.
Chiara.
Thank you all for the question. So let's start from Aziz. So the evolution of these models in Europe. So as you rightly said, Canada was the first country that experimented with private sponsorship of refugees. That started at the end of the Second World War. So they have a lot of experience. Initially, the Canadian approach was basically not in the law. So it was an informal relationship between the organization and the government. Then private sponsorships were crystallized in the law in the 70s. And since then, they've been working, they have different models, but the private one is probably the biggest. Now, what happened in Europe is that when the Syrian civil war occurred, and there were many, many sad episodes, particularly of migrants trying to come from North Africa to Europe. We have the disaster that happened in Lampedusa, etc. That really, really moved the communities, and there was really a call from communities, from the people, to do something. So I think that interjected what Canada started to do through various organizations. So the Canadian government, the University of Ottawa, UNHCR, the Shapiro Foundation. So these organizations put together what is called the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, sorry. And so they put together this group, and they started talking to European member states. So they organized workshops, webinars to try to help Europe to put together something similar to what Canada did. And what I read apparently is that initially Canada wanted, so the aim, the hope was to translate the Canadian approach into the European one, but they soon realized that Europe is very different. We have a different immigration system, we have different welfare arrangements. And so that's why we have different approaches in Europe that fit the different states the best. And Canada and the various organizations are still helping Europe, but now with more of a sharing and of best practices. And so that's how everything developed in Europe. So how did I do the comparison? I don't think I did a comparison in chapter 3 and 4. What I did, I put together, tried to describe the schemes, because one thing that I found in my research is that there was a lack of information. There were a lot of information, but in different places. So I tried to describe the key European schemes in as much as I could in a complete manner. And so these two chapters, as you will see, they are highly descriptive, but I thought I needed to do that for the sake of completeness and clarity. So the naming, how do we do the scheme select people? Well, I'll talk about the humanitarian corridors, which are the ones that have this diluted version of naming. So the humanitarian corridors, so there are these organizations like mainly religious, so Community of San Degidio, the Tavola Valdese, Caritas, that sign a memorandum of understanding with the Italian state, France, Belgium, and Andorra. And in this memorandum, unfortunately, the text of the memorandum are not publicly available, but I got some information from people that managed to see them. And so there are articles that expressly talk about the criteria, the vulnerability criteria. What is interesting is that in the humanitarian corridors, the vulnerability criteria go beyond the definition of refugees of the Geneva Convention. So you have so the people that can access these programs, in theory, are the most vulnerable. So they are people that, so we have people with disability, elderly people, people that faced violence, etc., but they cannot claim the refugee status. So it's the idea to open that beyond the Geneva Convention. And so in the humanitarian corridors, the Sant'Egidio community or whoever the representatives in the country make the selection, they can do it just within this pool of people, so the most vulnerable of all. So I think that goes back to the question on the what is the pool. So that's how it works, at least in the humanitarian corridors. What happens in terms of breakup of sponsorship? Well, it depends. So in the humanitarian corridors, for example, the memoranda of understanding, the protocollo says that the sponsors are responsible financially for a maximum of 18 months. Which in certain cases can be prolonged. So it's quite broad in a way. Speaking to a person that was involved in practically writing the protocol. They said, well, most of the times, the people manage to get their independence after 18 months. If that doesn't happen, we don't abandon them. So perhaps sometimes we find necessary to reduce a little bit the financial support, but we will never put them on the street. For example, the house will always be there and we will always give money until they need it. Now, my first question was like, well, how do you do that? Because it's a huge responsibility. The thing is, in the humanitarian corridors, you have organizations like the Sant'Egidio community, for example, that get their money not just from public donations, but also from the 8 per 1000, so from a tax in the Italian tax return. So people can decide to do a donation through that, etc. So it's an organization that have big pockets. And so I think it depends on the nature of the sponsor, whether it's possible to continue that, support potentially forever, or in some cases, you need to put a break. In other cases, for example, in the German one, I think there's a limit of 2 years. In case of breakup of sponsorship, the government kicks in. And so the government will say, okay, they're not independent, but we can't send them back. So the government will help. In case the sponsorship breaks up, even before the terms of 2 years, that can happen because the sponsor, I don't know, as you said, maybe financial crisis for the sponsor, etc. Again, in many schemes, in the Canadian one for sure, and in some of the European ones, like the German one, there are sort of insurance insurance models where you talk to the organization, you say, okay, I cannot do it any longer, I have financial responsibility, and then you can have extra fund that can kick in from the government or from other sponsors. It depends a bit how but it's an hypothesis that is contemplated for sure. Let me see. After 5 years, they are still paying. So how much burden? It's a big burden. In my proposal, what I'm saying is, so when I say if the sponsor takes on the financial responsibility for welfare and for integration, I'm thinking about a system like the humanitarian corridors, where potentially if integration or the person doesn't find a job because he's too vulnerable, perhaps the support should continue. But I don't think these can work for every sponsor. And that's why I'm saying we shouldn't get rid or change what we have already. My proposal could be a side option for sponsors that really do have that financial capacity. If there's a problem from the financial point of view, I suggest perhaps that medium organizations can enter, like, for example, organizations like the community of Sant'Egidio or other organizations that have the possibility to compensate for the lack of financial possibility of the sponsor. In terms of secondary migration, that is a problem. Again, evident in the Italian schemes, for example. You have many people that entered through the humanitarian corridors, seemed happy, stayed a bit, and then left. What do? I think, I don't know, I mean, we can't force people to stay. in a place, right? These people might have decided to enter to the Italian one because initially thought it was something that was for them, but then realized that it's not anymore for them for various reasons, or maybe they have family members somewhere else. So I don't think we should put this as a barrier and say, okay, well, we have secondary movement, let's forget about the corridors. That's what happened, for example, with the initial sponsorships in the Czech Republic, in Poland, and in Slovakia, where there were too many secondary movements, and these countries decided, okay, because they want to go everywhere, we won't sponsor anymore. Personally, perhaps to me, it looks a bit as an easy way out. I think we should try to support, and if there are secondary movements, we can talk about it, but it shouldn't be a way to say, no, let's not do it because they don't want to stay here. Yeah.
Thank you, Chiara. There are two more questions, one in the room, one online, and a comment online.
Okay.
In the interest of time, we have 3 minutes left. So I'll read out loud the comment from Tatiana Baraulina from the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees in Germany. And she adds to the discussion that in Germany, sponsoring groups are financially and socially responsible for 12 months. After that, the welfare state takes over. So this is our comment. And then Annalisa, if you want to mute yourself, 30 seconds.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the presentation. Then just an observation and then a question linked to that. It strikes me that you, if I understood well, basically the main examples of schemes that include naming are the humanitarian corridors with Sant'Egidio, Caritas, Chiesa Valdese, and you said it yourself, these are all organizations that have a religious affiliation and a Christian religion affiliation, right? And so going back to your point about the states, let's say, shying away from the naming and the additionality features, because also they challenge a bit their, the sovereignty and deciding who's in and who's out, basically. I wanted to ask you whether you think that, this Christian religious affiliation plays a role, in a sense, in the fact that the state trusts these entities compared perhaps to other actors to do the naming. And so in a sense, going to your conclusion about financial responsibility of the sponsors, like, do you think that would be enough for states to trust other actors to take all of this on board? Thanks.
Just one more from Ettore, and then.
Yeah, very briefly. Thank you very much. Speaking to the lawyer, I think that legally, this is a rather complex situation because it's a trilateral relationship, right? The person, the sponsor, and the state. And one thing you haven't touched so much upon is the legal relationship between the sponsor and the sponsored. One issue was raised by Friedrich is the idea, can you make, for instance, a place of residence conditional on the sponsorship? And it seems your answer was not. But I was wondering whether were other conditions, or there is any potential condition that can be part of this legal relationship. For instance, can a sponsor state that the sponsor has to collaborate or contribute to the activities of a sponsoring community organization, something like that? Is there anything in your experience, or is how much can the sponsor go in creating conditionalities on the sponsoree relationship?
And if I may, I'll just add that the naming part is quite interesting, but it begs, I guess, some of the critiques that you were about to tell us, but you didn't have time to tell us about transparency and accountability. And also at the same time, connected to what Friedrich and Ettore were saying, the managing expectations part on the side of the sponsee. Because if they are named, then probably they know exactly where they're ending up. Well, whilst if they're not named, then they might arrive somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. So I'm going to start from the last two questions. So I think there is actually, I didn't mention it, but when I talk about the humanitarian corridors and I describe the protocols and the memoranda in one of the articles of the memoranda that is not just in Italy, but it's replicated in the other states that apply these schemes. There are the sort of duties of the beneficiaries, and one of them is that they are willing to participate to the program in Italy, for example, or Belgium, France, because they're happy to, they either have a network there or they're happy to be sort of shepherded by the organizations that are taking the financial and emotional and integration responsibilities. So there is in the protocol that condition. And I think it makes sense because you want to see a sort of level of engagement. What I'm saying is that people are not goods, right? We change, we fall in love, we change our mind. And so there could be, may well be, this initial willingness, but things might change in due course. And so there has to be an acceptance, I guess, of that and of the reality that many people are willing to stay in the long run, some others won't. So that's certainly that aspect. So in terms of transparency and accountability, yes, I mean, one thing that I discovered in the research, particularly with the corridors, is that the interviews are done by representatives of the various organizations in loco. And although there are clear criteria in the memorandum, there seems to be a flexible application of these criteria, which sometimes can be good because maybe you get even the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, but sometimes maybe not. So it's something that has to be acknowledged and thought through properly, absolutely. I think then going to the question, the online question about, if I understood it correctly, like the involvement of Christian organizations and the trust of the government in Christian organization. I mean, I don't know about, I don't know very well about other states, but I know a bit more about Italy because there's more available in terms of research. The community of Sant'Egidio was involved with the Italian states much before the introduction of the private sponsorship because they did a lot of work in terms of peacemaking, so not private sponsorship, but peacemaking in conflicts in Kosovo and Mozambique. And I know for sure that the Italian state trusts a lot the Sant'Egidio community and their method. It's called, it even has a name, it's called the Sant'Egidio method of peacemaking. And so I'm sure that if these corridors were proposed by an organization that was less known by the state, perhaps there would be more reluctance. And I think the fact that Sant'Egidio was involved really helped in terms of number and in terms of allowing the selection process. I have to say, in Italy, we only have Sant'Egidio involved with other Christian communities, but in Belgium, we have Sant'Egidio and the Muslim community and the Jewish community as well. So the Belgian one is really interesting because it's an interfaith humanitarian corridor, so you have different voices involved.
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you all for participating. We're 5 minutes over time. Apologies for that, but the topic was really interesting. Good luck with this book, which is also available online, open access. And yes, looking forward to our next also MPC seminar. Thank you.